Camilla recently learned that her entire future role in the monarchy has been predetermined without consulting her, and to be honest, the process was far more severe than anyone in the public is aware of. We are not discussing a gentle transition over the next 10 years or a gradual change in responsibility. The most bizarre thing isn't that they did it, rather, it's that Charles knew about it for months and kept it a secret from Camilla. William and Catherine got down, looked at the actual structure of the family moving forward, and basically wrote Camilla out of anything that matters. Imagine, for example, being married to the king and believing that you have finally won your position after decades of battling for it, only to discover that your husband has already approved a plan that entirely ignores you and hasn't even mentioned it. This is the point at which the story becomes extremely intriguing. To ensure you don't miss any updates on this scenario, make sure you're subscribed to Crown Watch before we dive into all of this. William's desire to give Princess Charlotte a genuine job with real responsibilities, rather than merely a ceremonial title she would trot out for photo ops, was the driving force behind the entire endeavor. He wanted her to be named the official royal guardian of the crown, which would give her the legal authority to assist George, act as a stand-in for him in times of need, carry out charitable work on his behalf, and essentially serve as his right hand, much like Anne has done for Charles. Giving that to a young girl is a big deal. That type of power necessitates training, confidential briefings, and genuine constitutional weight. William wasn't requesting permission either. Months before any of this was made public, he and Charles had already sorted this out. His autograph as Charlotte's father and the upcoming king was the only one that was absent. When Camilla once realized what was going on, she didn't simply object behind closed doors, she lost it. Why would they give such authority to a little girl? She reportedly spat at her own employees, asking how any of this had been let to occur without her knowledge. Declaring that William and his family had just committed the worst error of their life, she stormed through her private rooms. And look, I can understand Camilla's displeasure at not being consulted. Anyone could be, however, the whole argument crumbles when you consider what she was saying in contrast to her motivations. She attempted to justify this by claiming that Charlotte was too young, that Anne, Edward, and Sophie were being insulted, and that the public was confused. However, if you look at those claims for longer than 5 seconds, none of them stand up. Since the Anne argument is the most obvious, let's start with it. Camilla contended that it would be disrespectful to Anne, Edward, and Sophie to give Charlotte this kind of title, bypassing the typical route that everyone else had to take. 3 royals who had worked for decades to earn every responsibility they performed for Charles, one step at a time, without taking any shortcuts or receiving any titles beforehand. How would it look, she inquired, if a child skipped that entire queue entirely and landed at the front before she'd even grown up? This seems acceptable on the surface, doesn't it? Preserving the hierarchy and honoring seniority, however, Camilla and Anne have never been able to get along, never once. Not behind closed doors nor in public, Anne has never given Camilla a curtsy, not in a hallway, not at a single event, not even in private. Camilla was aware of that, that was known to all members of the family. Therefore, it didn't make sense when Camilla abruptly began to act as though she was very worried about Anne's sentiments being harmed. While Anne battled for something much more intimate, her name served just as a respectable shield. To be honest, it's nearly offensive to everyone watching that she believed no one would notice that. The claim that Charlotte is too young is another issue. William was asked directly by Camilla if Charlotte was old enough to handle such a large load. At that point, she ceased to act as though this had anything to do with Charlotte. This whole thing was Catherine's doing, she told him directly. At the end of the day, it wouldn't truly be Charlotte having that power, therefore no one could call it selfish if a mother grabbed authority and called it obligation. Catherine would be tugging every rope behind her daughter's back, concealing herself behind a child's name while making the actual calls. William's expression quickly became icy. He approached her speaking in a quiet, firm voice and instructed her to never again discuss his wife in such a manner, and that response, in my opinion, tells you everything you need to know about how far Camilla went. In these familial conflicts, William is typically fairly restrained. Having witnessed his father avoid conflict for decades, he learnt to avoid conflict, but as soon as Camilla accused Catherine of manipulating the succession for her own gain, he abandoned any presence of diplomacy. He was no longer negotiating, he was establishing a barrier and making it apparent that crossing it would have repercussions. What followed was unexpected for Camilla. William just looked at her after she had concluded her tirade about Catherine allegedly planning everything and explained that Charles had already secretly consented to this months prior. He then took a moment to consider that. Then he leaned in, grinning slightly, and remarked that it was amusing that Charles had never told her, made her question why. Perhaps he already knew just how she would respond. Perhaps he didn't trust her after all. That kind of remark doesn't only hurt right away. Now that Camilla is coping with more than simply William and Catherine making choices without her, it festers. She had to live with the fact that her own husband, the man she battled for decades to be with, purposefully kept her in the dark about something this important. What else hasn't he informed her if he kept her in the dark about this? When Camilla heard that, she fell silent. She was left standing there with nothing to hurl at William as he picked up the folder, got up, and went. She wasn't done, though. Still persuaded that she could soften this, delay this, or even kill it altogether, she made the decision to completely avoid William and asked for a private meeting with Charles. And that's precisely when everything fell apart. A portion of the succession plan leaked directly to a royal reporter before Charles had even finished comparing the two versions of the plan. The headline-grabbing article portrayed Charlotte as a young girl who was given authority over royals who had earned it the hard way. Just hours before, Camilla had warned against the exact kind of public outrage. William's staff had to act quickly to limit the harm before it affected public opinion, and worse, before Charles had even made his last decision. The leak was traced back to a member of Camilla's own team. She denied having any knowledge of it. Here's what she never clarified, though. Why did that leak story nearly exactly fit her own grievances? For example, this is nonsensical if that is the case. Either someone provided that reporter exactly what Camilla wanted the public to hear, or someone on her team independently arrived at the exact same point she'd been making behind closed doors. There is no alternative way to calculate the chronology. Camilla marched directly to Charles and took a completely different approach, as the leak was already causing pandemonium. She contended that a position with this much authority, the authority to act on George's behalf during a national emergency, could not be quietly resolved within a family. She wanted it to be formally reviewed by the government. Take a moment to consider that. To prevent one girl from receiving a title, she was prepared to drag the entire monarchy into the public eye. Tradition is not being protected in this way. That's attempting to cause such a huge constitutional headache that everyone gives up and abandons the endeavor. Charles cut her off right away. He made it apparent that William had already made up his mind and that he would not reverse it. However, you have to go back approximately 6 months to the afternoon that began all of this in order to comprehend why William was battling so hard. It took place at the Commonwealth Youth Service, a massive royal event that drew young people from all across the Commonwealth to St. George's Hall. That day, George was scheduled to deliver his first official speech. William was supposed to be standing next to him. Louis and Charlotte were only supposed to sit close by and observe. George heard something he was not supposed to hear just minutes before he was called forward. Two officials are speaking in a low voice and using phrases like concerning, music, and not the first time this month. George's entire world turned upside down in an instant. This was no longer anxiety over forgetting a few sentences. Suddenly he thought that someone he loved might be gravely ill, that no one was telling him the truth, and that everything behind the scenes was quietly collapsing as he prepared to walk out on that platform. Then William abruptly exited the hall without saying anything. On his way out, he didn't even look at George. Instead, a look of utter concern crossed his face as he vanished via his side door with a helping hand. The family was not informed of the situation. It would be months before rumors began circulating throughout the palace that William had been hurried off to answer an urgent call, that someone close to him, perhaps even Charles or Catherine, had unexpectedly become ill that same afternoon. However, nobody in that hall knew anything at that very moment. They only knew that George was standing there by himself and that William had disappeared. The program was impatient. The guests had already taken their seats. George, a young child who had not yet delivered his first formal speech, had to gather himself and walk out there with no father by his side, with the weight of whatever he had just heard bearing down on his shoulders, while officials whispered behind their hands. William underwent a transformation at that time. He came to see that although the family had planned their entire future around George becoming king at some point, they had provided him with very little structural backup should things went wrong. If something had occurred to both William and Catherine that day, or if William had been rendered disabled, George would have been left alone and without a sibling who could legally support him. Charlotte would have been watching her brother handle everything on his own, with no official job and no way to assist. In order to ensure that it never occurred again, William began working on this strategy. That's where the idea of a royal protector originated, making sure the future king had someone who could genuinely assist him when things fell apart was more important than seizing power. When Camilla was fighting against it, she was unaware of all of this. She simply witnessed a title being given to a youngster and used her personal experience of fighting for every bit of respect she ever received in that household to interpret, and that's exactly what she told William. She claimed that she had fought for every bit of respect she had ever received for decades in this household. No one gave her anything. One slow year at a time, she acquired every piece of authority she currently possessed. And suddenly, in one afternoon, a youngster who was hardly old enough to comprehend the concept of true power was given it all. William saw it right away. This had nothing to do with tradition, Anne, or Charlotte being too young. This was about Camilla and how painful it was for her to witness a youngster get what she had worked so hard to create in a single signature. And even if you don't particularly like Camilla, I believe there's something truly depressing about that. She is correct that she battled for decades to reach her current position. For years, she was despised by the people. She was dismembered by the media. In the eyes of the public, she was frequently compared to Diana and never once prevailed in that comparison. She put up with it all because she loved Charles and thought the public and family will eventually accept her, and now she's witnessing Catherine enter that same prominence and effortlessly acquire what Camilla battled for years. Catherine is adored by the public. At events they call her by name, she is especially requested by the organizers. Camilla never once understood that. Therefore, even if it came from a place of suffering rather than justice, she was posing a genuine question when she asked Catherine directly if any part of her felt guilty for it. Catherine gave a composed and decisive response. She claimed that Camilla was compared to Diana by the public for years, and that Camilla never once prevailed in that battle. And that's precisely why she wasn't startled by any of this. Camilla then pressed more harder. She questioned whether the crown had ever truly desired Camilla to be at the center of it all. Catherine didn't think twice, she declined. Charles was desired by the monarchy. He was the only one who ever chose Camilla, not her family, the general public, or the organization she spent her entire life attempting to fit in. It is cruel since it is true that she was only ever accepted because one man adored her. Camilla was not selected by the organization. Camilla was Charles's choice. The family had no choice but to embrace her, because there was no other choice. The public put up with her, but no one ever wanted her there. And now that Charles is getting older and the family is focusing on the next generation, that tolerance is vanishing. William and Catherine have already taken center stage, so there's no reason to keep her there. Since you can witness every single stress in that family unfold in real time, the meeting where all of this culminated is quite intriguing. Anne was present. When Camilla questioned her directly, she openly acknowledged that she had been aware of the scheme all along. In front of everyone at the table, Camilla reminded Anne that she had never once curtsied to her in all the years she had been a part of this family. Not even once. She wanted everyone in the room to know exactly what this moment was, so she spoke it aloud. Schedules and responsibilities weren't the only issues. Anne had been feeling this way for years, but she had never had the opportunity to voice her feelings until now. Anne's answer was completely icy. She asked Camilla if she had something more powerful or if that was the best she had. Then she stated that the future belonged to William and Catherine, not to sentiment, and that the family had an obligation to make appropriate plans for the next 20 to 30 years. The section that sliced the deepest was then added by her. She pointed out to Camilla how old she was and stated bluntly that she would not be able to participate in the majority of those upcoming years. It wasn't an insult, so that response hurt more than if Anne had just lied to her. There was no attempt to soften the statement, it was just a reality. Anne had no intention of being harsh. She was just reluctant to act as though the monarchy's future should be based on someone who wouldn't be around for the majority of it. The gathering came to an abrupt conclusion. Camilla stood up and left. For the first time that day, she was by herself with Charles for later that evening, and she let her emotions run wild. She questioned him about whether he had ever really thought she belonged in the center of this family's, or if he had merely required her there until he no longer needed her. Charles took some time to respond. He stared at her for a long time, trying to find a version of the truth that wouldn't ruin her. He was unable to locate one. He told her in private that although he had loved her, the public would never feel the same way. Something in Camilla's chest gave way entirely. Just above a whisper, she asked him to return the music. He didn't say anything. He just sat there and let the quiet speak for him. Another meeting was held a week later, and this time it wasn't the same as the first time everyone sat down. A senior advisor entered with a second paper that was far thicker than the previous folder. Everything significant moving ahead was discussed in this one. If Charles ever had to pull back further, the family would need someone to take charge of every significant occasion, including state banquets, coronation anniversaries, and Commonwealth celebrations. Camilla immediately reached for it. Before she had a chance to touch it, the advisor pulled it back. Not signed yet. Catherine had already given her approval, and William had already studied it. Charles's signature was the only one absent, so that Charles could sit with it by himself. Everyone was ordered out. At first he didn't even touch it. He simply sat there contemplating the 3 reasons that had previously been hurled at him. William insisted that rather than waiting until there was a real issue, the family should prepare ahead of time. Catherine had already demonstrated to him that she could complete the task flawlessly with her own 2 hands. Then there was Camilla, years of devotion, years of history, and his own assurance that his reign as king would not be a fleeting moment before William overthrew everything. William entered first and didn't waste any time on. He made it clear to Charles that they could no longer afford to wait. Relationships with the Commonwealth and state visits required clarity immediately, not months after. He told Charles once more that Catherine was already being greeted by large crowds wherever she went, and that organizers had already called out to her by name. Charles raised his head and asked him directly if popularity should truly be the deciding factor in such a significant matter. William didn't give up for a single second. He refused, yet disregarding what the people already want would only backfire. Before Charles could respond to that, Camilla entered. She told him once more that eliminating her would make him appear transient, as if his whole rule was merely to keep the seat warm till William was ready. William's expression completely transformed. This has nothing to do with applause, he informed her plainly. Refusing to make plans now would just leave things open in the future. This was about ensuring the family survived for decades. Charles had had enough. With the exception of Anne, he sent everyone out, and Anne didn't mince words. She made it clear to him that he alone had to make this choice, not William, not Catherine, and not Camilla. She cautioned him that he would harbor hatred for years if he signed simply because his kid forced him to, and the uncertainty that hung over everything would only worsen if he refused in order to keep his wife safe. After sitting with that for a while, Charles took up the paper again. He took the pen and crossed off Camilla's name, which was printed directly on the paper after reading it twice. No hesitancy, no second thoughts, just one clean strike. To the advisor who was standing directly next to him, he dictated new language. There is only one line and no mention of Camilla. Whenever the monarch required assistance with, William and Catherine would assume public obligations. Before the advisor had finished writing it down, he signed it. The information was made public by the palace that evening, and to be honest, it had very little effect in comparison to what transpired precisely 1 week later. It took place during a small gathering, a public reception. The moment Catherine entered the room, everything changed. Halfway through, heads turned and discussions ceased. Before she had even walked a few steps inside, people began to approach her. Diplomats waited patiently for 30 seconds of her time, while charity leaders demanded pictures. Everyone desired a moment and a handshake. The audience followed Catherine wherever she went. Then, brutally, Camilla moved forward to welcome a group near the door. After a few brief handshakes and courteous grins, it was over. No one waited their turn to talk to her, nor did anyone request a picture. In a matter of seconds, individuals were turning away and returning to Catherine. It seemed as though Camilla had never entered the room. Everyone took notice. People were practically acting as though they didn't look well because this wasn't just an uncomfortable situation. It wasn't a single negative incident. The chamber had discreetly provided an answer to a topic the family had been attempting to avoid asking in front of everyone. In reality, who does the public want? And there was no clearer response. That response wasn't embarrassing for a monarchy that endures because people chose to support it. The mob had already decided on its future, so it served as a warning. The family was just catching up. From the other side of the room, William observed the entire event. He didn't require an explanation of what had transpired. When he found Camilla after the event, he told her something that was much more impactful than the quiet she had just been in. The events that took place in that room were nothing new. For years, it had been the case. The only distinction was that she had never stood there to witness it firsthand. That's the problem with being accepted instead of desired. Because everyone is courteous, the cameras are flashing, and the titles are still in place, you might go years without realizing it. Eventually, though, the courtesy wanes, and it becomes hard to deny reality. Camilla simply experienced that moment in front of everyone in the room. Charles discovered her by herself later that evening. He insisted that titles and schedules had nothing to do with their marriage and attempted to separate the public aspect of their family from what they truly meant to each other in private. Camilla didn't buy it at all. She had not worked for decades to become the center of this family just to be informed that the center was no longer important. This was the line that completely altered their relationship when he reminded her that she was still queen. Long after the true strength of a title has faded, it can remain on paper. Even if you have a crown on your head, it will mean nothing if no one is asking for you or listening to you. She received nothing in return from Charles, just stillness, no defense, no retaliation. And everything he may have spoken was drowned out by that quiet. One minor element revealed the very following morning that this was no longer temporary. Information regarding forthcoming Commonwealth events was distributed. It was originally received by William's office. Soon after, people started copying Catherine. Almost as an afterthought, Camilla's team received it last. A minor detail, isn't it? However, everyone in that palace knew exactly what that meant. It was no longer just one horrible week. From now on, this is just how things operate every single day. The flow of information had changed irreversibly. The structure of power had been revised. And Camilla was now completely out of the loop after spending decades putting herself at the center of everything. Camilla offered them nothing in public. When she had to grin, she did so. She didn't criticize any reporters. However, the royal family understood that her composure in public wasn't a sign of weakness. The rest of the family had no idea what was about to happen to them. Because this is what no one seems to be discussing, Camilla didn't reach her current position by giving up when things became difficult. She married the future king despite being the most despised woman in Britain for 30 years. She had to deal with criticism from the public, harassment from the media, and a family that never really embraced her. She survived it all. Therefore, the notion that she will just disappear into the background now that William and Catherine are popular doesn't align with our understanding of Camilla's behavior. She has plans. She is simply astute enough to avoid doing it in public, where it would be obvious to everyone. Now that William and Catherine are aware of who they are dealing with, things are different. They've witnessed her strategies. For years, they had observed her navigating this family. Additionally, they recently took a step that significantly alters the board she is playing on. They did more than simply remove her responsibilities. Charles's readiness to defend her stance was the one thing she could always rely on. He personally crossed out her name and signed the document. Camilla can no longer rely on the king to save her, no matter what happens next. And that's not just a political loss, that's a personal one, for someone who based her entire career on the fact that one man loved her enough to stand up for her. They are the ones that pierce the deepest.